It was a cold October morning in New York City, the kind that made you pull your coat tighter and walk a little faster to escape the biting wind. The trees lining the sidewalks of Columbia University had begun to shed their golden leaves, scattering them across the stone pathways where students hurried to their classes. Among them was Jordan Carter, hands in the pockets of his gray hoodie, walking toward Hamilton Hall, where his advanced calculus lecture was about to begin. He didn't stand out much, liked it that way. Hood up, head down, mind focused. He had always been that kind of student, the kind who let his work speak for itself. But even as he climbed the steps to the lecture hall, he could feel it had familiar weight pressing on his shoulders. It wasn't just the usual anxiety of a tough class. It was something deeper. The moment he entered the lecture hall, the air shifted. It wasn't dramatic, not outright hostility, no one pointed or whispered, but there was a subtle change, something only people like him knew how to recognize. The way a few students glanced his way and then looked at each other, the way some professors sitting in the front row narrowed their eyes for just a second before returning to their notes. Jordan had grown used to these silent judgments. This class was no ordinary one. The professor, Dr. Meredith Ellison, was known across the department for her brilliance and her ruthlessness. If you weren't good enough, she made sure you felt it. And today, the stakes were even higher. The front row wasn't just filled with students, several guest professors from other universities were here, watching, evaluating. This was an open lecture, meant to showcase Ellison's teaching methods and to quietly weed out those who weren't fit for the department. Jordan slipped into a seat in the middle row, setting down his worn notebook. His fingers absent-mindedly spun his pen, his mind already running through the day's topic. He was here to learn, to push himself, to prove not to others, but to himself that he belonged in this room. But not everyone saw it that way. At the front, Dr. Andrew Lancaster, one of the most senior professors in the department, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. His gaze swept the room, then landed on Jordan. A small smirk played at the corner of his lips as he murmured something to the professor beside him. "That one," Lancaster said, his voice just loud enough to be heard by a few students nearby. "I give him 10 minutes before he gets lost." The professor next to him chuckled softly. "Affirmative action at work, no doubt," he said, shaking his head. "They never make it past the first semester." Jordan didn't turn his head, but he heard every word. He didn't flinch. He never did. This wasn't the first time he had been underestimated. Ellison entered then, her heels clicking against the cold tile floor, cutting through the murmurs like a razor. The room fell into absolute silence. She didn't demand respect, she commanded it. She took her time scanning the lecture hall, her sharp blue eyes moving from student to student. And then, for the briefest moment, she stopped on Jordan. That pause so quick that most people wouldn't have noticed told Jordan everything. She saw him. And in that second, she had already decided what kind of student he was. Ellison turned, picked up a piece of chalk, and with precise strokes, began writing equations on the board. The room sprang into motion, notebooks flipped open, fingers raced across laptop keyboards. Students scrambled to keep up as dense mathematical symbols filled the board. Jordan sat still, his eyes moving across the equations with calm focus. Then, his brow furrowed. Something wasn't right. It was subtly small deviation, something that wouldn't cause an immediate issue but would derail everything later in the problem. He scanned the room, expecting someone else to notice. No one did. Most students were too busy copying, their eyes locked on their screens, their pens moving frantically across their notebooks. Not really understanding, just following. Jordan hesitated. He knew what would happen if he spoke up. He had seen it before. Ellison wasn't the type to like being corrected, especially not in front of a room filled with guest professors. And he knew the front row was waiting for a reason to prove he didn't belong. He could stay silent. Let the lecture continue, let someone they expected to be brilliant point it out later. But something in his gut twisted at the thought. Jordan hated arrogance. He hated people who assumed they were never wrong. He hated the way people like Lancaster and Ellison looked at students like him and decided without knowing a thing about him that he was destined to fail. So he took a slow breath, raised his hand, and broke the silence. "Professor," he said, his voice steady, clear. "There's a mistake in the transformation." The room froze. Ellison's chalk stilled mid-stroke. A sharp tension crackled through the air. For a moment, she didn't turn around. Then, slowly, she did. A faint smile touched her lips, not the kind that meant praise. The kind that meant a trap had just been set. "A mistake," she said, voice smooth, unreadable. She glanced at the board, as if only entertaining the idea. "Are you sure?" The whispers began instantly. Jordan didn't blink. "Yes," he said. Ellison's smile didn't fade, but something in her expression shifted just for a second. She turned back to the board, eyes scanning. The room wasn't watching her anymore. They were watching Jordan. Waiting for him to crumble. Waiting for her to destroy him. One of the guest professors leaned toward Lancaster. "Well," he murmured, barely hiding his amusement, "this should be interesting." Jordan gripped his pen tighter. He had just stepped into a battle he hadn't asked for. But if they thought he was about to back down, they were about to be very, very wrong. For a few seconds, the room remained frozen, the air thick with the weight of unspoken expectation. Jordan's voice had broken the silence, and now every pair of eyes was locked onto him. The faint scratching of pens against paper had stopped, fingers had stilled on keyboards, and even the guest professors in the front row had leaned forward slightly, waiting. Ellison hadn't moved yet. She stood in front of the blackboard, one hand still holding the piece of chalk, the other resting at her side, her shoulders composed but rigid. A mistake. That's what Jordan had said. She turned slowly, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile people gave when they were about to prove you wrong. "A mistake, you say?" Her voice was soft, almost amused, as if she were humoring him. Jordan sat perfectly still, his hands resting on his desk, his heartbeat steady. He had made his decision, and there was no turning back now. "Yes," he said again, his voice clear. "Right there, in the transformation step." Ellison let out a quiet then turned back to the board, lifting the chalk again, her movements slow and deliberate. She scanned the equation, her eyes tracing the symbols as if considering his claim. The classroom remained so silent that the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead became the only sound. Jordan could feel the way people were waiting for her to cut him down. Then, after a long moment, she turned back to face him. Her smile remained. And Jordan knew what was coming next. "Are you sure?" The words floated in the air, but beneath them, there was something else, a warning. Jordan recognized it. She wasn't asking him to confirm. She was giving him a chance to back down. He met her gaze without blinking. "Yes. I'm sure." A slight shift passed over Ellison's face, something so small that most people wouldn't have caught it. But Jordan did. For just a fraction of a second, she had hesitated. And that was enough to tell him what he already knew. He was right. Ellison pressed her lips together, turning back to the blackboard. For another long moment, she scanned the equation, her hand hovering just above it, the piece of chalk motionless between her fingers. Then, in a movement so subtle it almost went unnoticed, she tightened her grip on the chalk. She saw it now. The mistake. Jordan could tell. And yet, when she turned back around, her face showed nothing. "You must be mistaken," she said, her voice smooth. "I see no error here." A ripple of soft laughter broke the silence. The front row, the guest professors, the students who had been waiting for this moment exchanged glances, smirking. Jordan's chest tightened, but he didn't let it show. He had expected this. Ellison wasn't the kind of person to admit a mistake. Especially not in front of them. And now he had a choice. He could nod, pretend he was wrong, let the moment pass. Or he could stand his ground. His fingers curled slightly against his desk. He already knew the answer. Jordan pushed back his chair and stood. A whisper swept through the room like a wave. Even the guest professors seemed surprised. Ellison arched an eyebrow, but she didn't stop him. She wanted to see what he would do next. Slowly, Jordan made his way to the front of the classroom. His footsteps echoed against the tile floor, each step feeling heavier than the last. The weight of all their eyes pressed against him, but he forced himself to stay steady. He reached for the chalk she had left resting on the tray. Ellison didn't hand it to him, but she didn't stop him either. That, in itself, was a victory. Jordan raised the chalk to the board and carefully erased the mistake. He didn't rush. He didn't fumble. Every movement was precise. With a few strokes, he corrected the transformation, rewriting the problem in its proper form. When he stepped back, the room fell silent again. No one spoke. No one laughed. Because now they saw it too. The mistake had been real. And Jordan had been right all along. Ellison stood with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She stared at the board for several seconds, her blue eyes scanning the corrected equation. Then, without a word, she turned back to the class. "Well," she said, her voice cool. She nodded toward the board. "It appears he's correct." A few students shifted in their seats. A few professors exchanged quick glances. But no one said anything. Jordan stood there, the chalk still in his hand. He wasn't expecting applause. But for the first time since walking into this room, he felt something shift. It wasn't just about one math problem. It was about everything that had led up to this moment. It was about every time someone like Lancaster looked at him and assumed he would fail. It was about every moment Ellison had tried to dismiss him before he even had a chance to prove himself. And it was about proving, once and for all, that he deserved to be here. Jordan set the chalk down and turned away from the board. He didn't need to gloat. He didn't need to smirk or rub it in their faces. Because the truth was already there, written in clean, precise chalk strokes for everyone to see. He walked back to his seat without a word, his head held high. And though the classroom went back to normal, though Ellison continued her lecture as if nothing had happened, he knew. And they knew. Nothing was the same anymore. For the rest of the lecture, Jordan kept his head down, but he could feel the change in the room. The way some students stole quick glances at him. The way a few whispered when they thought he wasn't paying attention. The way Dr. Ellison's voice seemed a little sharper, her pacing a little faster, as if she was trying to regain control of the classroom. She didn't acknowledge what had happened. No praise. No good job. Just that single, cold acknowledgement. It appears he's correct. That was it. Jordan didn't expect more. He wasn't looking for approval. But he knew something had shifted. And so did everyone else. By the time the lecture ended, students were already gathering their books, packing up their laptops, but the energy in the room felt different. As Jordan slung his backpack over one shoulder, he noticed Dr. Lancaster, one of the guest professors, leaning over to another professor, speaking in low tones. Jordan caught a few words. "Watch him. I don't like." And then, as if sensing Jordan's gaze, Lancaster looked straight at him. For a second, Jordan thought the professor might say something. But Lancaster just gave a small, knowing smirk. Then turned away. Jordan exhaled slowly and left the lecture hall. He had won today. But he wasn't foolish enough to think the battle was over. Because people like Lancaster? They never let things go that easily. That thought lingered with him as he walked across campus, his hands tucked into his pockets, the wind carrying the distant hum of students talking, the rustling of fallen leaves skimming across the pavement. He should have felt good about today. He had done something most students wouldn't dare. He had challenged a professor in front of an entire room and been right. But there was something unsettling about the way Ellison had brushed it off, about the way Lancaster had smirked at him, about the way people were still talking even as he left the building. Like they were waiting for something. Waiting for him to fail. Jordan clenched his jaw and kept walking. He didn't know what was coming next. But whatever it was, he would be ready. The next lecture came faster than Jordan expected. This time, when he walked into the classroom, the atmosphere was different. Students were already seated, some glancing toward the blackboard, others whispering to each other. But when Jordan stepped in, a few eyes turned toward him. Not many, but enough. Enough to let him know that people remembered, that they were watching. Dr. Ellison stood at the front, her usual presence cold, unreadable, flipping through her lecture notes. Then, just as the last few students were settling into their seats, she did something unexpected. She turned, lifted a piece of chalk, and began writing a new problem on the board. This one wasn't like the others. Jordan knew immediately. The symbols stretched across the blackboard, a maze of equations and transformations, more complex than anything she had written before. Even before she finished, Jordan could hear the soft murmurs behind him. He saw a few students exchange uneasy glances, some already flipping through their notebooks, trying to prepare themselves. He recognized this tactic. It wasn't a lesson. It was a challenge. Ellison finished the final line and set the chalk down. Then she turned to face the class. Who would like to solve it? Silence. Of course. Even the best students in the class weren't jumping at the chance. Jordan watched as a few hands twitched, as if some students were considering it, but the none by one they hesitated. They weren't sure. They didn't want to risk it. That was the point. Ellison wasn't just testing knowledge. She was testing confidence. And no one wanted to be the one to get it wrong in front of everyone. Jordan knew he should just stay quiet. Just let someone else struggle through it. But that wasn't who he was. He didn't mind a challenge. And he knew what this was. It was a warning. She was showing him that if he wanted to question her, she could make things very difficult for him. Jordan took a slow breath. Then, before he could think too hard about it, he raised his hand. A few heads turned toward him. Ellison's expression didn't change. If she was surprised, she didn't show it. Go ahead, she said smoothly, stepping aside. Jordan pushed back his chair and walked to the board. He could feel the weight of the room pressing against him. This time, it was different from before. Last time, he had just pointed out a mistake. Now, he was stepping straight into the fire. He picked up the chalk and studied the equation. It was hard. There was no denying it. But hard didn't mean impossible. Not for him. He started writing. At first, the room was completely silent. Then, as he moved from one step to the next, he heard soft murmurs. A chair shifted. Someone flipped through their notes. He wasn't solving it the way most people would. He was skipping unnecessary steps, moving faster than expected. And that's when he realized. Some of them weren't just watching. They were learning. They were seeing something new. And Ellison saw it too. She crossed her arms, watching him with quiet intensity. Jordan kept going. Every step was clear, deliberate. His hand didn't tremble. His pace didn't slow. He knew he was right. He could see the answer before he even finished writing it. And when he finally set the chalk down and stepped back, there was a moment of absolute stillness. No laughter. No smirks. Just silence. Ellison's gaze drifted over the board. Then she turned back to the class. Does anyone see an error? No one spoke. Not even Lancaster, who was watching from the front row, his lips pressed into a thin line. Jordan waited. He knew how this worked. Ellison would find some flaw, some technicality to poke at. She had to. She couldn't just let him win like this. But after a few long seconds, she finally exhaled softly and nodded. Well done. 2 simple words. Spoken with no warmth, no real praise. But it didn't matter. Because they were real. Jordan didn't need applause. He didn't need Ellison's approval. Because today, the numbers had spoken for themselves. And he had been right. Again. As he walked back to his seat, he caught a few glances from students. Not the usual mocking looks. Not the usual skepticism. This time, there was something different in their eyes. Respect. Recognition. And when Jordan sat down, he let out a breath. Because this wasn't just about solving a problem. This was about proving that he belonged. And today, no one could deny it. Not even Ellison. Not even Lancaster. Not even the students who had once laughed behind his back. He had done what they never expected. And this was just the beginning. The news spread faster than Jordan could have imagined. One day, he was just another student fighting to prove he belonged, and the next, people were whispering his name in the halls. Not with mockery. Not with doubt. But with curiosity. Because Dr. Ellison herself had thrown him a challenge. And not just any challenge. The National Mathematics Championship. An event where the best of the best competed. Where students from Harvard, MIT, Stanford, Princeton, and Caltech, the ones who had been groomed for this their whole lives, battled for the top spot. It wasn't just a contest. It was a statement. And Ellison? She knew exactly what she was doing. Because it didn't matter that Jordan had humiliated her in class. That he had stood up, walked to the board, and proven her wrong not once, but twice. She could still win the war. All she had to do was push him into a game he couldn't possibly win. A game where the odds were already stacked against him. She was counting on him to fail. Jordan saw it. He knew it. And still, when she had stood in front of the class and made the challenge, made it sound like an opportunity rather than a trophy, he had nodded without hesitation. "All right," he had said. "I'll participate." The moment the words left his mouth, a ripple went through the room. Some students stared at him in disbelief. Others exchanged glances, murmuring under their breath. Even Lancaster, sitting in the front row, had chuckled softly, shaking his head like Jordan had just signed his own academic death sentence. No one believed he could actually win. And that was exactly why he had to do it. Because this wasn't about winning a medal. This was about everything else. It was about proving once and for all that he deserved to be here. So, for the next 4 weeks, Jordan did something he had never done before. He disappeared into his work. While other students went home after lectures, while they relaxed, went to parties, hung out in dorm rooms, Jordan was in the library. Every single night. His only company was the glow of his laptop screen, stacks of old competition problems, and the constant ticking of the clock. He studied the hardest problems he could find. He pushed himself to think faster, smarter, better. He didn't just want to solve problems, he wanted to understand them inside and out, to see the patterns before they even appeared. Because if he was going to step onto that stage, he wasn't going to go in blind. He was going to be ready. At first, no one noticed. But then, people started talking. Students whispered about how late he stayed in the library, how he barely took breaks. Even Brian, his only real friend, started to get worried. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Brian said one night, leaning against the library table as Jordan flipped through an advanced calculus textbook. Jordan didn't look up. "I don't have time to take it easy." Brian sighed, crossing his arms. "You know who you're up against, right? The people in this competition? Some of them have been doing this since they were 10 years old. They've had private tutors, mentors." "I know," Jordan said. "Then why are you doing this?" Brian asked. "You don't owe anyone anything." Jordan finally looked up. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, steady. "I owe it to myself." Brian studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. And without another word, he pulled out a chair and sat down. "If you're doing this," he said, "then I'm going to help you." Jordan didn't smile. But he felt something tighten in his chest. Because for the first time, he wasn't completely alone in this. The day of the competition arrived with a cold, sharp wind cutting through the air. Jordan stood outside the auditorium, his hands in the pockets of his hoodie, his breath coming in slow, measured exhales. He had done everything he could to prepare. Now, it was time. Inside, the room was packed. Rows and rows of students, all dressed in buttoned-up shirts, blazers, polished shoes, the kind of kids who had been trained for this their entire lives. Jordan? He still wore his hoodie, his jeans, his sneakers. He didn't need to look the part. He just needed to win. At the front of the room, the judges sat at a long table, their expressions calm but serious. Ellison was among them. So was Lancaster. Jordan could see the quiet amusement in their eyes, the way they sat back in their chairs, waiting for him to crack under pressure. They were so sure he didn't belong here. They were waiting for him to prove them right. Jordan took a seat. The clock ticked forward. A man in a dark suit stood up, adjusted his glasses, and spoke into the microphone. "Welcome to the final round of the National Mathematics Championship," he said. "You are the top competitors in the country. The best of the best." There was a pause. Then the screen at the front of the room lit up with the first problem. Jordan barely heard anything else. Because the moment he saw the numbers, his mind locked in. The equations spread across the screen in sharp, white text, each one more complex than the last. Jordan didn't hesitate. His pen hit the paper. The room around him faded away. Everything narrowed to the numbers, the symbols, the calculations. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't fumbling. He was solving. Fast. Faster than even he expected. At one point, he noticed something. The student next to Hyman, MIT PhD candidate, kept glancing at him. And Jordan realized. He was writing faster than everyone else. Ellison saw it too. Her lips pressed together. Lancaster, who had once smirked at him in the lecture hall, was now leaning forward, watching him with an expression that was no longer amused. Jordan kept writing. One problem. Then another. And another. Time blurred. Pens scratched against paper. Frowns deepened across the room as students struggled to keep up. But Jordan? He was ahead. And when the final question appeared, the one meant to break even the strongest competitors saw exactly how to solve it before anyone else had even started writing. The room was silent when he put his pen down. He was done. And he knew. Even before the judges looked at his work. Even before they checked his answer. Even before they called his name. He had won. And this time, no one could take that away from him. Not Ellison. Not Lancaster. Not anyone. Because today, Jordan Carter had just beaten the best minds in the country. And the whole world had seen it. Jordan sat in his chair, his hands resting on the smooth surface of the table, his breath steady. The auditorium was massive, its high ceilings stretching above rows and rows of students who had come from the best universities in the country, each one carrying the weight of their school's reputation on their shoulders. The tension in the room was thick, pressing down like a slow-building storm. There were no easy smiles, no casual conversations. Competitors sat stiff-backed, their fingers tapping lightly on their pens, eyes darting toward the large digital clock at the front of the room. Everyone was waiting. Waiting for the first problem. Waiting to prove why they were here. Jordan had spent the last month preparing for this moment. Late nights in the library, long hours hunched over equations, pushing himself beyond exhaustion because he knew that no one expected him to last in this competition. They saw his hoodie, his jeans, his scuffed sneakers. They saw a kid who wasn't supposed to be here. The whispers had started before he even took his seat. That him? The one from Columbia? Thought it was a joke when I saw his name on the list. You ever heard of him before? Nope. That was the thing about competitions like this. The names were supposed to be familiar. The students from MIT, Stanford, and Harvard had already built reputations in the academic world. They had been trained for this, raised in environments where mathematics was more than a subject, it was a birthright. Jordan? He wasn't a name they recognized. And that meant, to them, he didn't exist. But that was fine. Jordan didn't need them to see him. Not yet. The head judge, an older man with thin silver glasses, stepped up to the podium. His voice cut through the silence like a knife. Welcome to the final round of the National Mathematics Championship. The words carried weight, sinking into the room, pressing against every mind seated at those long tables. This is the culmination of months of competition. Each of you has already proven yourself against the best minds in the country. But today, we will determine who is truly the best. The students barely moved. Jordan could feel the hum of quiet arrogance that filled the room. The belief that no matter how hard the problems were, they were the ones who would find the answers. He recognized that confidence. He had seen it before in Dr. Ellison. He had seen it in Professor Lancaster. People who didn't just expect to win, they assumed it was already theirs. Jordan sat still, his heartbeat slow and steady. The judge adjusted his glasses. Your first question will appear on the screen. Jordan straightened in his chair. The massive digital screen at the front of the room flickered to life. And then, the first problem appeared. The room stilled. Jordan's eyes scanned the equation, his mind breaking it apart the moment it appeared. He could hear the soft intake of breath from the students around him, the slight creak of chairs as competitors leaned forward, adjusting their positions. It was a hard problem. But it wasn't impossible. Not for him. He picked up his pen and started writing. The competition had begun. Jordan's world shrank to the smooth surface of his paper, the sharp edge of his pencil, the numbers and symbols forming a path that only he could see. Nothing else existed. Not the rows of students beside him, not the judges watching from the front. Just the numbers. He wrote with purpose, each line of his work precise. And as he reached the final step, he felt it. That familiar click in his mind. The answer was there. He had solved it. He put down his pen and glanced up at the clock. Less than half the time had passed. Jordan's eyes flicked sideways. Other students were still deep in concentration, their brows furrowed, their fingers gripping their pens tightly. Some had barely made it halfway through the problem. A few caught him looking. And their faces changed. It was subtle, but Jordan saw it. The first crack in their certainty. Because he had finished before them. And he was supposed to be the one who didn't belong. The next problem appeared on the screen. Jordan exhaled, stretching his fingers slightly. Then he picked up his pen and kept going. The second problem was harder. More layered. It would take time. But Jordan had trained for this. While other students had spent their childhoods in private study sessions with world-class tutors, he had spent his nights sitting alone in the library, teaching himself the hardest problems he could find, forcing himself to think in ways his professors hadn't taught him. He had learned to see solutions differently, to find the quickest path, the cleanest answer. And now, as he moved through the second problem, he could feel it happening again. That rhythm, that flow. The way his mind fit the pieces together effortlessly. And then, the second answer fell into place. He stopped writing. Looked up. More heads turned toward him. More eyes flicked to the clock. Because Jordan was ahead. Way ahead. Dr. Ellison's gaze didn't waver. But Jordan could tell she saw it too. And so did Professor Lancaster. They weren't smiling anymore. Problem 3 appeared. Jordan leaned forward, gripping his pen. The real test had begun. This problem wasn't just about math. It was about strategy. The kind of problem meant to separate the good from the great. Jordan studied it for a long moment. Then he saw it. The pattern. The way through. He didn't hesitate. The numbers fell into place, line after line, and when he reached the end, he felt the shift in the room. Other students were still struggling. But Jordan? He put his pen down and waited. Lancaster leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped together. Jordan could almost hear the gears turning in the professor's mind. He was trying to find a way to dismiss this, to explain why Jordan had finished so fast. Maybe he had guessed. Maybe he had skipped steps. Maybe he had made a mistake. The judge at the front of the room cleared his throat. He walked slowly between the rows of students, stopping near Jordan's table. He lifted Jordan's paper. Then he scanned it. The room held its breath. A long moment passed. Then the judge looked up and nodded. Correct. Jordan didn't move, didn't smile, didn't gloat. He just sat there, calm and quiet, as the reality settled over the room. Jordan Carter wasn't just keeping up. He was leading. And that changed everything. The next problem appeared. And for the first time, Jordan saw something new in his competitors' faces. Not just confidence. Not just focus. But something else. Worry. Because they had underestimated him. And now, they were realizing their mistake. Jordan sat still, his fingers lightly gripping his pen, his heartbeat steady. The final problem had just appeared on the massive screen at the front of the auditorium. This was it. The moment that would decide everything. The room felt different now. Tension clung to the air like fog, thick and heavy, settling over every competitor. Jordan knew why. It wasn't just another question. It was the hardest problem yet, the kind designed to break even the best minds in the room. And everyone knew it. Pens hovered motionless above paper. Brows furrowed in deep concentration. Some students leaned forward, staring at the problem like they could force it to make sense through sheer willpower. Jordan didn't move. Not yet. He steadied the screen, letting his mind pull apart the layers, breaking it down piece by piece before he even touched his pen to the page. This problem wasn't just about math. It was about who could stay calm under pressure. About who could think fastest when it mattered most. About who would rise and who would fall. And Jordan? He wasn't about to fall. He exhaled slowly, then picked up his pen. And he started writing. The moment he made his first mark on the page, something clicked into place. It was like watching a puzzle solve itself. Line after line, each step leading smoothly to the next. His mind moved faster than his hands, guiding him through a path no one else could see yet. The rest of the room was still hesitating, still searching for a way in. But Jordan? He had already found the way out. He didn't waste a second. Every number, every symbol, every transformation was precise, like he had known the answer before he even started. Minutes passed. The only sound in the room was the faint scratching of pencils on paper, the occasional shuffle of a chair, the quiet hum of the clock counting down the seconds. But then, a movement. A rustle of paper. Someone looked up. And Jordan knew. They had noticed him. The whisper started small, barely audible over the silence. Then another. And another. People were watching now. Not the problem. Him. He could feel their eyes on him, could sense the shift in the room. The other competitors, the ones who had been so confident at the start, were starting to glance at his paper, at the speed of his pen, at the way he wasn't hesitating, wasn't pausing to double-check his work like they were. Jordan finished another line. And another. And then, the final step. The final calculation. The answer. And just like that, it was over. He put down his pen. The sound of it hitting the desk was almost too loud in the silence. And then he leaned back, hands resting loosely on the table, and waited. For a moment, nothing happened. The students beside him were still writing, still struggling, still caught in the web of numbers that Jordan had already untangled. Some had barely reached the halfway point. But he was done. And he knew he was right. That was the part that mattered. He didn't have to check. He didn't have to doubt. He had seen the answer the moment he started. At the front of the room, the judges exchanged glances. One of them, an older man with silver-framed glasses, stood up slowly. He walked toward Jordan's table, his shoes clicking softly against the polished floor. The entire room seemed to be holding its breath. The judge reached down, picked up Jordan's paper, and adjusted his glasses. Then he read. A long silence followed. Jordan sat still, watching. The judge didn't look at him. Not yet. Instead, he walked back to the panel of other judges, placed the paper down in front of them, and leaned in, whispering something too low for anyone else to hear. A second judge leaned forward, scanning the paper. Then a third. And then. One of them looked up at Jordan. There was something in his expression, something between disbelief and admiration. Jordan saw it. And so did Dr. Ellison. She sat in the front row, arms crossed, her face perfectly unreadable. But Jordan knew her well enough now. He saw the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers curled just a little tighter against her forearm. She knew. She knew what had just happened. Another judge, a woman with short-cropped hair, turned back toward the microphone. Her voice rang out through the auditorium. We have a completed answer. The words cut through the silence like a knife. A murmur spread through the room, students whispering to one another, heads twisting to see who had finished. Jordan felt the shift again. The moment they all realized it was him. Not the MIT PhD candidate. Not the Harvard student who had been leading the early rounds. Not the Stanford competitor who had walked in like he had already won. Him. Jordan Carter. The kid from Columbia. The kid no one had taken seriously. Until now. The whispers grew louder. But Jordan didn't react. He just sat there, watching the judges, waiting. Waiting for them to confirm what he already knew. Another long pause. Then. The judge at the microphone nodded. She adjusted the papers in front of her, lifted her gaze to the audience, and finally spoke the words that would change everything. The answer is correct. For a second, there was no reaction. Then the whispers turned into something else. Something bigger. Somewhere in the back of the room, a student let out a low whistle. Another let out an astonished "no way." But the professors, the ones who had doubted him the most, remained silent. Dr. Ellison didn't move. Professor Lancaster sat rigid in his chair, his jaw tight. And Jordan? He simply nodded. Because there was nothing left to say. The numbers had spoken for themselves. The judge cleared her throat again, waiting for the noise to die down. Then she glanced at the clock. There are still 10 minutes remaining, she announced. Competitors may continue working. A few students turned back to their papers, some still trying to fight through the problem, desperate to finish before the clock ran out. But others? They had already set their pens down. Because they knew. They had just lost. Jordan didn't look at them. Didn't need to. Instead, he folded his arms across his chest and leaned back in his chair, staring straight ahead, calm and composed. Let them talk. Let them wonder how he had done it. Let them remember this moment. Because today, Jordan Carter had walked into a room full of the best minds in the country and he had beaten them. And not just beaten them. He had shattered every expectation, rewritten the narrative, forced them to see him in a way they never had before. He had won. And no one could take that away from him. Not Dr. Ellison. Not Lancaster. Not anyone. The final buzzer rang. Pins dropped. The competition was over. But for Jordan, this was just the beginning. The competition was over. The room wasn't quiet anymore. Students were whispering, shaking their heads in disbelief, still trying to process what had just happened. Some looked at Jordan like they were seeing him for the first time. Others glanced toward the judge's table, waiting for what came next. But Jordan? He sat perfectly still, arms crossed, calm. Because he knew. The numbers had already spoken. He had won. And there wasn't a single person in this room who could deny it. The judge at the microphone cleared her throat, her voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. "The final results are being reviewed," she said. "Please remain in your seats." Jordan wasn't worried. He didn't need to see the review. He had seen his own work. And he knew there were no mistakes. The judges huddled together, murmuring in low voices, scanning papers, checking numbers. It was all just a formality. The truth had already settled over the room like a heavy weight. And Jordan could feel it. But there was someone else who felt it too. Dr. Meredith Ellison. She hadn't moved. Hadn't spoken. She sat rigid in her chair, eyes locked on the judge's table, her face unreadable. But Jordan wasn't fooled. He had spent enough time in her class, enough time watching her, to recognize the signs. The slight tightening of her jaw. The way her fingers curled just a little too tightly around her pen. The way she wasn't looking at him. She knew. And she hated it. For months, she had been the one in control. The one who set the rules, who decided who belonged and who didn't. And now? The student she had dismissed, underestimated, tried to break. He had just beaten the best minds in the country. And there was nothing she could do about it. The head judge stood up. The noise in the room immediately died down. All eyes turned forward. The moment was here. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked out over the auditorium. After careful review, we are pleased to confirm the results. A pause. Jordan could hear his own breathing. But his heartbeat? Steady. He already knew. The judge looked directly at him. The winner of this year's National Mathematics Championship is Jordan Carter. For a moment, it was silent. Then, applause. Not loud. Not overwhelming. But real. Genuine. A few students clapped hesitantly at first, as if still unsure how to react. But then, more joined in. It wasn't just for the victory. It was for what it meant. Jordan had done what no one had expected. He had walked into this room an outsider, an underdog, and he had beaten them all. Not by luck. Not by chance. But by being better. Jordan stood slowly. Not in celebration. Not to gloat. Just to acknowledge the moment. Because this was his. And then, he turned. And his eyes met Dr. Ellison's. For the first time, she looked directly at him. No words were exchanged. No congratulations. Just a long, heavy stare. And Jordan? He held it. Because he knew what she was seeing now. Not just the student she had tried to ignore. Not just the kid she had dismissed in the lecture hall. Not just the name on a roster she had expected to fade away. She was seeing the truth. She had been wrong. And Jordan had forced her to see it. Ellison's lips parted slightly, as if she was about to say something. But she didn't. Because what was left to say? The numbers had spoken. Jordan gave her a small nod. Then he turned, gathered his things, and walked toward the exit. He didn't need to hear her say it. He had already won. And she knew it. The next morning, the atmosphere in the lecture hall at Columbia University was different. It wasn't just another day. Everyone knew it. The students who usually rushed in, flipping through notebooks, checking emails, whispering about upcoming assignments, they were silent today. Because today, the air felt charged. Dr. Ellison walked in right on time, as she always did. Her heels clicked against the tile floor, her presence commanding, sharp. But something was missing. That weight she always carried, the invisible authority that made students shrink in their seats, the power she held over every room she walked into. It wasn't as strong today. Because now there was someone else in this room who had proven they were just as powerful. Jordan sat in his usual seat. Same hoodie. Same jeans. Same calm, steady expression. But nothing was the same anymore. Dr. Ellison set down her materials. She adjusted her glasses. Then, for the first time since the competition, she spoke. And when she did, her voice was different. Measured. Careful. Before we begin today's lecture, I want to say one thing. The room went completely still. Ellison paused, as if choosing her words carefully. Then she glanced toward Jordan. Jordan Carter has proven that talent has no limits. That was all. No apology. No praise. Just a single acknowledgement. But the weight of it, it was heavier than any lecture she had ever given. The students didn't move. Some stole quick glances at Jordan, waiting for his reaction. But he didn't smile. Didn't gloat. Didn't need to. Because he had already won. He had walked into this classroom months ago, and they had all decided who he was before he even spoke. They had assumed. They had judged. And now, they had to sit in the reality they had tried so hard to ignore. Jordan gave a slight nod. Then he opened his notebook and waited for the lecture to begin. Because today was just another day. But for everyone else in that room, everything had changed. Ellison didn't speak to Jordan after class. Didn't stop him in the hallway. Didn't pull him aside. She didn't need to. Her silence was an acknowledgement of its own. But others? They saw what had happened. And they weren't so silent anymore. That afternoon, when Jordan walked across campus, something strange happened. Students who had ignored him for months, who had never spoken his name before. They nodded at him. Some even said his name out loud. Some stopped him. "Hey, Jordan. Congrats, man. That was unbelievable." He wasn't invisible anymore. Because when you prove yourself on the biggest stage, people remember. But for Jordan, that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the lesson. The reminder that you don't have to ask for permission to belong. You just have to show up. Do the work. And when the moment comes, prove them wrong. Jordan kept walking. Because this was only the beginning. The wind was sharp that evening, cutting through the streets of New York City like a cold whisper. Jordan walked alone, his hands tucked into his hoodie pockets, his breath misting in the air as he moved through the crowd. The sidewalks were busy, filled with students, professionals, tourists, people who had no idea what had just happened in that competition hall. No idea how everything had changed. For the world outside, it was just another evening. Just another day. But for Jordan, it was the moment he had waited for his entire life. He had done it. He had proven himself, not just to them, but to himself. And yet, as he walked past the glowing windows of coffee shops and bookstores, past the soft hum of traffic and street musicians playing on the corner, he couldn't help but wonder. Why did it have to be this way? Why did he have to fight so hard just to be seen? Why did he have to be twice as good just to be considered worthy? Why had they looked at him and assumed he wouldn't last? The weight of it all pressed against him, not as anger, not even as frustration, just understanding. This was the world. This was how it had always been. But maybe, just maybe, it didn't always have to be. Jordan turned the corner onto a quieter street, the sounds of the city dimming slightly. His mind was still buzzing, replaying the past few months, the moments that had led him here. The stairs in the lecture hall. The murmurs behind his back. The way Dr. Ellison had looked at him that first day, assessing him like she had already decided he wouldn't make it. The way Professor Lancaster had smirked, whispering to his colleagues, waiting for him to fail. They hadn't just doubted his intelligence. They had doubted his right to be here. But what they had never understood, what people like them never seemed to grasp, was that he had spent his whole life pushing through barriers they had never even had to see. The unspoken rules. The invisible ceilings. The way the world judged you before you even had a chance to speak. Jordan stopped at a crosswalk, watching the traffic blur past, headlights flashing against wet pavement. It wasn't just about him. It had never been just about him. Because for every Jordan Carter sitting in that competition hall, there were hundreds more students who had been told, in one way or another, that they didn't belong. That they weren't good enough. That they shouldn't even try. Jordan thought about the kids sitting in classrooms across the country, staring at a textbook, wondering if it was even worth it. Wondering if the world would ever let them in. And that was why this victory mattered. Not for the medal. Not for the title. But for them. For the ones who would come after. The light turned green. Jordan kept walking. The next week, Columbia University felt different. It wasn't that people treated him like some kind of celebrity. There were no cameras, no reporters waiting outside lecture halls. But people knew. Students who had never spoken to him before nodded in the hallways. Some stopped him, shaking his hand, telling him how inspiring it had been to watch him win. Even professors who had once ignored him now spoke his name with something close to respect. And in Dr. Ellison's class? That was where he felt it most. She didn't mention the competition again. Didn't bring it up, didn't acknowledge it beyond that single, measured statement from before. But there was something different in the way she looked at him now. She didn't dismiss him anymore. Didn't glance past him when asking the class a question. She saw him. And that was enough. Jordan took his usual seat, notebook open, pen resting between his fingers. The whispers had stopped. The stares had stopped. Because now, there was nothing left to doubt. One afternoon, Jordan sat on the steps of the library, sipping a coffee as the sun set behind the buildings. Brian dropped down beside him, setting his backpack on the ground. "You gonna tell me how it feels yet?" Brian asked, nudging his arm. Jordan smirked, taking another sip. "How it feels?" Brian rolled his eyes. "Come on, man. You just won the biggest math competition in the country. You took down people from Harvard, MIT, Stanford. Hell, even Ellison had to acknowledge you. And you're sitting here like it was just another test." Jordan leaned back, staring up at the sky, watching the deep oranges and purples stretch across the clouds. "Because it's not about the competition," he said finally. Brian frowned. "What do you mean?" Jordan exhaled, tapping his fingers against his cup. "I mean, yeah, I won. And yeah, that felt good. But it shouldn't have been this hard." Brian was quiet. Jordan looked down at the students passing by, laughing, talking, hurrying across campus like they didn't have a care in the world. "I had to fight for every inch of space in that room," he said. "Had to prove myself over and over again just to be seen as equal." Meanwhile, there were guys in that competition who walked in already respected before they even opened their notebooks. Brian didn't argue. Because he knew it was true. Jordan shook his head. "I want to live in a world where the next kid like me doesn't have to go through all that just to be taken seriously. Where they don't have to spend their whole life proving they belong before they even get a chance to compete." Brian nodded slowly. "That's why you did it, isn't it?" he asked. Jordan turned to him. Brian shrugged. "You never cared about the trophy. You cared about the message." Jordan smiled. "Exactly." The story spread. Not in a flashy, headline-grabbing way, but in the way that mattered. Students talked. Professors whispered. Somewhere, a kid who had been doubting himself heard about Jordan Carter, the student who had walked into a room full of the best minds in the country and proven he was one of them. And that changed something. Because barriers don't break all at once. They crack. They shift. They bend under the weight of moments like this, until one day, they finally fall. Jordan knew his journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges. More battles. More people who would try to put him in a box before they even knew his name. But now he knew how to handle it. And so did everyone else. He didn't have to fight just to be seen anymore. Now, when he walked into a room, they already knew who he was. And for the first time, they were ready to listen. That night, as he stood at the window of his dorm room, staring out at the city lights, Jordan allowed himself a small smile. Because this wasn't just his victory. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told they couldn't. And if his story could help even one person believe in themselves, then it was worth it. Every struggle, every doubt, every moment of silence that had finally been shattered. Jordan exhaled, closed his notebook, and turned off the light. Tomorrow, there would be more work to do. And he was ready for it. Because now, he wasn't just playing the game. He was changing it. Forever. Life often places barriers in front of us, some visible, some unspoken. They can come in the form of doubt, judgment, or the quiet assumption that we don't belong. But the truth is, no one else has the power to define our worth. We prove that through persistence, courage, and the willingness to stand tall, even when others expect us to fall. Jordan's story isn't just about winning a competition, it's about challenging expectations. It's about refusing to be overlooked, even when the world tells you to stay in your place. It's a reminder that the strongest victories aren't just personal, they open doors for those who come after. We all face moments when we're underestimated, when people assume we're too old, too young, too inexperienced, or too different to succeed. But success isn't about fitting into someone else's mold. It's about stepping forward, showing up, and proving if only to ourselves that we are more than what the world assumes. No matter where you are in life, keep moving forward. Your journey, your wisdom, and your resilience matter more than anyone's expectations. And when you prove them wrong, you don't just win, you change the game for everyone who follows.